Things had changed. It was 1864, and for 3 devastating years, the 34 states in America had been locked in deadly combat. What had started as a political dispute over the sovereignty of individual states had become a struggle for survival. The nature of the struggle had also changed. What was emerging was the face of warfare as it would be seen 50 years later in Europe. Trenches dominated the battlefield. Dig in was the byword of the day, and soldiers on both sides made it their first priority. Ulysses S. Grant was commander-in-chief of all Union armies, and since May was throwing his military weight at Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia with less than sanguinary results. Grant's methods, while not particularly imaginative tactically, were novel strategically. Despite reverses on the battlefield, he continued to move south, forcing Lee closer and closer to his capital city of Richmond. The road south was marked with the graves of thousands of men in blue and gray, who had given, in Lincoln's words, their last full measure of devotion. In just over 30 days of prolonged combat, 80,000 men on both sides were now listed as killed, wounded, or missing. 41% of the Yankees had fallen to Southern guns, and replacements had to be rushed to Grant to fill the ranks. 46% of the Confederate Army would not fight again, and their losses would be much harder to replace. Grant's army would move. Lee's army would anticipate his move and get there first. The Confederate entrenchments invariably proved to be impenetrable, and after several days of costly and inconclusive fighting, Grant would slip around the southern flank and Lee would race to get ahead of him. Time for the Confederacy was growing short. Space for Lee's army to maneuver was running out. Lee was still winning battles, but Grant was winning the war. When the American Civil War had started, the armies and tactics more closely resembled those of the Napoleonic period than of modern warfare. The troops marched into battle shoulder to shoulder, bayonets fixed, flags flying, across open fields against an enemy who stood up to meet them. Firefights often took place at ranges of 100 yards or less, and the carnage was terrible. The time had come for change, and everybody knew it. By the time Grant's spring campaign of 1864 was underway, it was clear that things would never be the same. By the beginning of 1864, the northern industrial muscle was starting to make its power felt. The factories of New England and the Midwest were in full wartime production, and their output was staggering. The military draft, first introduced a year earlier, combined with energetic recruiting efforts, were filling the Union ranks faster than Southern rifles could empty them. Although the Southern states enjoyed a coastline nearly 3,000 miles long, the Federal Navy, now approaching 600 ships, was fast closing its ports, and supplies arriving from overseas found fewer and fewer places to put their cargo ashore. The Confederacy was dangerously short of men, materiel, and even the basic necessities for its citizens. Its territory was shrinking as Union armies struck deep into the heartland of the South, destroying farms and cities as they went. Lincoln had effectively prevented European intervention with his carefully timed Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. The British and French could not, in good conscience, support a victory that would prolong slavery, and thus kept their distance. Now the federal government took a step that drove another nail into the Confederacy's coffin. They began to actively recruit and train regiments of black soldiers. Eventually, 180,000 blacks served in the Union Army, and their contribution came at a critical time. Some were newly freed slaves. Many were already free men, but all served with pride and distinction, and some went on to glory. Grant's first setbacks took place at the battles of Wilderness and Spotsylvania. The Federals continued south in spite of these, and met with another disaster at the Battle of Cold Harbor, where 7,000 Yankees fell in less than 30 minutes. The Union commander Grant decided that the time had come for a bold move. He wanted to disengage his army from Lee and swing south to Petersburg, just 20 miles south of Richmond. Petersburg was an important rail center through which flowed most of the supplies for Lee's army. Severing this lifeline would cripple the Confederate army and force them out into the open where the superior numbers of the Federal forces could be brought to bear. To accomplish this, he had to remove his 100,000-man army from Lee's front, cross miles of marshland and the formidable obstacle of the James River, and arrive in front of Petersburg, 40 miles in Lee's rear and ringed with extensive fortifications, without Lee realizing that he had gone, and before the Southern soldiers could occupy the city's works. Such a move, made deep in enemy territory, was an incredible undertaking, and Grant needed a diversion or two to cover his intentions. He decided on 3 diversions and turned to his fiery cavalry leader, Philip Sheridan, for help. Sheridan was to take 8,000 troopers and conduct a raid on the Virginia Central Railroad, attempting to destroy that railway as a usable means of support for the Confederate forces. The raid would also serve to draw off Confederate cavalry that might discover the movements of the main army. The second diversion was to come from Benjamin Butler, whose 33,000-man force was to sail up the James River, land at a small peninsula known locally as Bermuda Hundred, and threaten either Richmond to the north or Petersburg to the south. The third diversion was to come in the Shenandoah Valley, where Franz Sigel was to move down the valley, cut off the flow of food supplies from there, then move east towards Richmond. Sigel's campaign ran into an early snag at Newmarket, where he was met and defeated by a smaller Confederate force on May 15th. Grant replaced him with David Hunter and ordered the Federals there to try again, and, if successful, to link up with Sheridan. Sheridan got off to a good start, getting as far as Trevilian Station near Charlottesville before meeting with any resistance. As hoped, Wade Hampton and the Confederate cavalry followed Sheridan, and on June 11th, his 4,700 troopers engaged Sheridan near Trevilian, surrounding and nearly destroying the brigade of George Custer. Sheridan's column fought through to Custer and drove the Confederates off. Hunter did not join Sheridan, however, and the Union cavalry elected to return to Grant's line. They were hounded by Hampton's troopers all the way, and only interrupted the rail line traffic for about 2 weeks. Benjamin Butler had fared little better in his attempts to threaten the 2 major cities. Landing at Bermuda Hundred on May 5th, Butler became timid, and a small Confederate force quickly bottled him up on the peninsula. It was not until June 8th that he finally pushed forward to implement Grant's plan. The hastily drawn-up plans were turned over to an incompetent field commander, Quincy Gilmore, a decision Butler came to regret. A series of uncoordinated attacks were countered brilliantly by Confederate officers Henry Wise and Raleigh Colston, who maneuvered the less than 1,000 defenders to meet each thrust. After 8 hours of sparring, Gilmore's men gave up the fight and fell back. 2 of Grant's 3 diversions had so far yielded no results. Grant himself, however, was undeterred. His own movement was just getting underway on June 12th, and it was going very well indeed. Pulling back from Lee's lines near Cold Harbor, Grant marched his columns quietly to the banks of the James River. Other troops were transported by ship around Fort Monroe. The Union engineers tackled the James River with ingenuity and expertise. At the crossing point, the river was 2,100 feet wide and nearly 100 feet deep. Lashing pontoons together and anchoring them to vessels moored in midstream, the bridge was completed in only 8 hours, and soon the first contingent of men, horses, wagons, and artillery was on the southern shore. Lee had been completely fooled, as his cavalry was off chasing Federal horsemen, and his infantry scouts could find no Yankees in front of them. Lee was slow to accept that Grant was heading for Petersburg, and held his position as he tried to determine where the Yankees would reappear. Grant decided to send Butler in against Petersburg again, and reinforced him with Smith's 18th Corps. Once again, the Federal forces moved toward the rail center, and the new Confederate commander there began to worry. Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard was a familiar name to the troops. The victor at the First Battle of Manassas, he had served as the commander of the Western armies after Shiloh. Now he took stock of a desperate situation. He had about 2,200 troops with him around Petersburg. He wisely concentrated them along a short front directly facing the Federal advance. The Union forces again advanced cautiously, never throwing their full weight against the Confederates. Beauregard counterattacked at intervals and managed to convince the Yankees that he was stronger than he actually was. Outnumbered 8-1, Beauregard could not hold out forever, and when Smith finally mustered his entire corps for a concerted assault, the Confederate line gave way. Nothing stood between Smith and the city of Petersburg, but he decided that capturing the rebel works was enough and went no further. Even the arrival of Winfield Scott Hancock and the 2nd Corps did not seem to change his mind. The 2 Union officers put off further attack until the next day. Overnight, the Confederates erected a new line, and Lee finally sent reinforcements. By dawn, 14,000 Confederates now faced the Yankees. But the Yankees had also been reinforced, and now numbered 50,000. Grant had beaten Lee to the city, and Lee was still not sure where he was. The Federals attacked every day for the next 3 days. Finally, on June 18th, Lee accepted the truth and put his army in motion for Petersburg. As the Confederate ranks continued to swell, the Federals kept up the pressure, but it was too late. The Yankees were exhausted from long marches and constant fighting. Memories of the slaughter at Cold Harbor were still fresh in their minds, and the southern fortifications were too strong. Thousands died in fruitless assaults. Now that it was clear that the city could not be taken by storm, Grant accepted the inevitable alternative: sea. Civil War earthworks were actually a series of constructions. First, a skirmish line would establish the foremost point of contact and dig rifle pits. Next, the engineers would connect the rifle pits into a long trench. Then, often working under cover of night, the engineers widened and deepened the trench, adding a ditch in front, a firing step inside, and shoring up the sides with logs held in place by uprights and anchors buried in the trench wall itself. Angles and distances were carefully calculated to permit crossfires and covering fire from artillery. Both sides also added traverses, or walls at right angles that protected the men from enfilading fire and exploding shells. Zigzag and even covered trenches sheltered the troops, moving back and forth from the rear to the front lines. To protect against the arching shells of mortar fire, the men constructed what they called bomb-proofs, which were little more than covered holes dug into the trench walls. Except for the building, there was little to occupy the men, and boredom set in quickly. On June the 24th, Colonel Henry Pleasance of the 48th Pennsylvania came forward with a novel idea. His regiment was composed largely of coal miners, and they thought they had a way to break into the Confederate lines. Their plan called for a tunnel to be dug from behind the Union lines to under the Southern works at what was called Elliott's Salient, a distance of over 510 feet. Such a tunnel had never been attempted before, and the Federal engineers were skeptical. But Burnside, Pleasant's Corps commander, approved, and the work began. Without the support of Grant's headquarters, the miners improvised tools and techniques. They used empty boxes to haul out the massive amounts of dirt the digging produced. Day and night they labored in the cramped spaces, inching forward. As the tunnel grew in length, Pleasance devised an ingenious solution to the growing problem of ventilation. About 100 feet in from the entrance, and still behind the Federal lines, a vertical shaft was run to the surface. At the base, a fire was built to create a strong draft that pulled out the stale air. Pleasance then sealed the entrance just before the shaft, and ran a long pipe to the head of the tunnel. The draft created by the fire sucked fresh air in through the pipe, which emerged right where the miners were digging. The ventilation problem thus solved, the digging resumed. By July 26, the tunnel was ready, and Burnside submitted a plan to Grant to explode a huge mine planted in the tunnel under the Confederate works and assault through the breach. Grant had ordered Winfield Hancock and his Second Corps to attack the rebel lines around Richmond, still attempting to break through by more traditional methods. Lee had foreseen Hancock's attack, however, and quietly moved troops north to counter it. Grant realized that this meant Lee's lines around Petersburg were undermanned, and Burnside's plan just might work. On July 27th, Pleasance was ordered to fill the chambers under the rebel lines with 8,000 pounds of powder. The Federal artillery was concentrated along the front facing Elliott's Salient, and troops shifted to make the assault after the mine was blown. Less than 24 hours before the attack, Meade changed Burnside's plan. A division of black troops under Edward Ferrero had been trained for the assault and were slated to go in first. They were Burnside's freshest men and were eager to fight. Meade felt that the black troops were inexperienced and that sending them in first was politically dangerous. He was afraid he would be accused of using them as cannon fodder if anything went wrong. He instructed Burnside to replace them with a white division, and Burnside allowed his division commanders to draw straws to determine who would lead the attack. The assignment fell, unfortunately, to James Ledlie, an officer often known to have been drunk during a fight, and the worst possible choice. Upset at having his plan changed, Burnside failed to provide his men with engineers to assist them in opening the enemy's works, ladders for getting out of their own trenches, or entrenching tools to dig in on the other side. At 3:15 a.m. on the morning of July 30th, Pleasants lit the fuse to the mine, which was scheduled to blow at 3:30. By 4:15, nothing had happened, and Pleasants began to worry. Finally, 2 soldiers volunteered to go in and check on the problem. A bad splice had caused the fuse to go out, and it had to be relit. At 4:40 a.m., the mine blew. "280 men were killed outright by the blast, which opened a hole 200 feet long, 50 feet wide, and 30 feet deep. The Confederate line was breached, and the rebels stunned by the huge explosion. A quick rush by the Federals, and Petersburg could be theirs. But the Yankee attack began to unravel immediately. Almost 10 minutes passed before the Yankees advanced. With no way to exit their own trenches in formation, they streamed over the works in disorganized groups. Arriving at the crater, they were stunned by what they saw, and the attack dissolved as the soldiers started pulling rebels out of the sand and dirt and tending to the maimed and wounded men. Precious time passed as Ledlie's men filed into the hole with no unit structure and no leadership. Ledlie himself was behind the Union lines, indulging once more in a bottle he had procured from the surgeon that morning. Supporting troops came forward, only to be blocked by the crowd in the crater. The Confederates began to recover, and units on either side of the hole opened fire on the masses in front of their works. Ferrero's black troops came up and pushed their way through the white troops and towards the Confederate lines beyond the crater. Ferrero stayed behind with Ledlie, and thus there was no leadership at the front. Within 3 hours, some 10,000 troops had piled into the crater, and the Confederates were closing in around them. William Mahone led 2 brigades in a counterattack that pushed the Federals who had penetrated the lines back to the crater. Surrounding the crater, the slaughter was fearful. Some Confederates, meeting black troops for the first time, were so angered that they shot men who had already surrendered. By 2 p.m., all the Federals in the crater had either been shot or captured. The entire episode had been a disaster. Grant counted 3,500 killed, wounded, and missing, with nothing to show for it. The Confederates, initially surprised, had recovered quickly and suffered only 1,500 lost. Their lines were intact and the crater reoccupied. Grant wrote later that, "Such an opportunity for carrying fortifications I have never seen, and do not expect again to have." In the aftermath, there were some heads that had to roll. Burnside was relieved of command, and both Ledlie and Ferrero were censured for their conduct. There would be no more dramatic breakthroughs, only the tedium of long days and weeks of siege. Grant's adopted strategy was to extend his lines ever further south and west, cutting Lee's supply lines along the railroads, and forcing the Confederates to stretch their dwindling manpower ever thinner. Time was on the Federal side, and Grant would use his new ally well. Sheridan went after Jubal early in the Shenandoah, and soon that beautiful valley, which had so long supplied food to Southern armies, would be in flames. Grant continued to hammer at Lee's lines and cut his railroad supply lines one by one. Lee knew he could not win this kind of war, but fought on in the hope that the North would grow tired of the casualties and give up. It was a desperate, forlorn hope, but it was all the hope the Confederacy had left.
If you're eager to see more of our historical documentaries, please like, share, and subscribe.